Autonomous regions in German-occupied Russia. Russian states behind the German front line. Sounds something from Alternative History Hub, but it actually did happen. There was the Lokot Autonomous Region, where a pro-German Russian army that went by the name of SS RONA was calling the shots. And then there was a very obscure Zuev Republic, also known as the Republic of the Old Believers. More on that right now. Hey, good to have you back on the channel, and if you happen to be new, my name is Stefan, I'm a history teacher, I'm Dutch, and I'm hustling history for you. And if you like that, well, consider subscribing, and if you do so, do not forget to hit that notification bell. Many people assume that Russian collaboration with the Germans occurred after Operation Barbarossa had started, first with Hiwis and security units, and later armies such as the Russian Liberation Army, but it already had started before. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and the subsequent civil war, political refugees from Russia settled in Europe. These were known as white emigres. Their dream was to get Russia rid of the yoke of Bolshevism. Their ideas coincided with that of the Nazis, or so they thought, since we all know Hitler was seeking Lebensraum, living space, in the East. For Germans, not for Russians obviously. Yet, the Germans needed all the help they could get when starting the Herculean task of conquering the East. The first attempts at political collaboration with Germans were made in the Hammelburg POW camp. In August 1941, a committee for the struggle against Bolshevism was founded, which formed the basis for the Russia People's Labour Party, the RTNP. Its leaders were former Red Army commanders. The party's activities were overseen by German counterintelligence. The party's aims were spelled out. With the help of the Germans, the Soviet authorities were to be overthrown. Private property was to be restored, and a state with a democratic republican regime was to be established. The party program was published in November 1941, according to some accounts, on the 7th, the anniversary of the October Revolution, and was distributed among the prisoners. Now, not many volunteers came forward, but when better living conditions were promised, somewhere between 800 and 3,500 men joined. The following year, the party underwent a crisis because of disagreement and was then dissolved. That summer, the party was reborn, and around 120 people were in its ranks. Some right emigres came in command of the security units to fight partisans and Red Army stragglers behind the German front line. One was led by Russian emigrant Alexander Zosinski. His unofficially named White Cross detachments consisted of 330 men. Fighting against the Red Army stragglers, they endured over 100 casualties in the winter of 1941-42. The commanders of the White Cross asked the Germans to proclaim a provisional government in German-occupied Smolensk and declare the city the provisional capital of Free Russia. This never happened. When Smolensk was captured, a local lawyer named Boris Menchagin became the mayor of the city. He tried to re-establish city life, but the conditions were severe. Many buildings were destroyed, and of the 155,000 inhabitants, only 15,000 were still living in the city. Back in the 1920s, the white emigres had set up the Russian National-Labor Alliance of the new generation in Paris. The pre-war ideology of the NTSNP was close to the fascist ideology that were widespread in Europe at that time, but differed from that of the Nazis in not having a racist component. The alliance called for the overthrow of the Soviet regime and for the rebirth of Russia beneath a national banner. Of paramount importance were to be the interests of the working people, free of capitalist or communist coercion. In the chaos and the confusion of the war, its members made their way to other German-occupied cities in Soviet territory, such as Vyazma, Bryansk, and Orel, and there they tried to recruit members for their movement, but this was not successful. The NTSNP was not anti-German, but their interest of an independent Russia didn't coincide with the German interest. At the end, the party didn't occupy leading posts. Its men did participate in the terror to the local population. Most noteworthy against the Jews. On July 15, 1942, they slaughtered 2,000 Jews in the region. Another peculiar, perhaps even more peculiar example of collaborators inflicting terror against the local population was the Lokot Autonomous Region. During the autumn of 1941, in the village of Locot, located in the Orel province, local militia groups sprung up spontaneously. Soviet authority had by that time vanished from the area, and early October, the first German reconnaissance units arrived in town. As the Germans arrived in the town near the local hospital, a collaborator held a speech. He was a technical school teacher that went by the name of Konstantin Voskoboynik, and he was, according to his students, a gifted orator. For 24 years we have not had the right to speak the truth, and it is only now, after we have cast off the unendurable fetters of slavery and lies, that we can deliver a curse on the scoundrel Stalin, who has drowned Russia in blood. A local administration was founded. Konstantin Voskoboynik became the local mayor, and his deputy was Bronislav Kaminski. Their armed squads were named the People's Militia, and they armed themselves with weapons that were left behind by the Red Army as they had retreated. By the end of the year, small self-defense squads were set up in different villages in the Orel region. And Voskoboynik, he was determined to fight partisans mercilessly. They made use of a local print shop to print propaganda, and they also issued Order Number 1. Soon, Order Number 1 was given, and a manifesto of the People's Socialist Party of Russia, the NSPR, was issued. Using simple popular expressions, the proclamation voiced accumulated antagonism to the Soviet authorities. Described as an idiot of genius and a Caucasian donkey, Stalin was blamed for the crimes and repressions of the 1930s. The documents also showered praise on the Wehrmacht, expressing thanks to it for saving us from Stalinist drudgery. A 12-point program was issued. Half of the points were devoted to land ownership. Amnesty was given to the rank-and-file Communist Party members as long as they had not committed crimes towards the local population. The leaders of the Lokot Autonomous Region, they viewed their ideology as a Russian variant of National Socialism. Voskoboynik, he managed to expand his rule. Now, the Germans weren't too keen on the political side of things, but they were keen on the fact that Voskoboynik and his men were willing to fight against the partisans. Several coordinated attacks of the partisans towards the leaders of the Lokot Autonomy were undertaken, and in January 1942, Voskoboynik, he was killed by the partisans. His deputy, Bronislav Kaminski, and he continued the reign of terror of his predecessor. As historian Richard Overy wrote, backed by 10,000 men and thousands of camp followers, Kaminsky was left to pacify the region as he saw fit. His forces became part of the pretentiously titled Russian National Army of Liberation, though they liberated little, save other people's possessions. As the Soviets retook the area, the so-called Kaminsky Brigade, or the SS RONA, retreated with the Germans. The abbreviation of the Russian National Liberation Army, RONA, should not be confused with ROA, which was the Russian Liberation Army, led by Vlasov. Himmler, who controlled the brigade, directed it to Warsaw, where in the summer of 1944 the Warsaw Uprising had started. Their behavior was appalling. They slaughtered thousands of Polish civilians, which left ordinary SS men bewildered. Their cruelty matched the one of the equally notorious Dirlewanger Brigade. Because of their reckless and uncontrollable behavior, the commander Kaminsky was shot on German orders. The remaining forces would fight in Slovakia and were later redirected to Vlasov's army. Most of them surrendered to the Western Allies and were, according to the agreement with the Soviets, handed over to the Soviets, and most of them were executed or sent to the Gulag. I read that a female executioner who had worked for the Lokot Autonomy, named Antonina Makarova, was arrested in the 1970s. Decades after the war, she was discovered, arrested, tried, and executed. Now we're going to talk about a topic I think most of you have never heard about. It's a topic not much historians have written about, since many documents have been lost. And this chapter in history took place in Belarus. Now I know I actually was focusing on Russian political collaboration and this is Belarus, but the story is interesting, so please bear with me. And I'm going to talk about the autonomous region that was led by Mikhail Zuev, also known as the Republic of the Old Believers. Now, even on the internet, I wasn't able to find photos of this, let alone copyright-free photos. So, bear in mind that I'm gonna make use of photos that are representative, but not entirely accurate. But hear me out, this story is interesting. By the end of August 1941, the Germans had fully occupied Belarus. Now, as I talked about in the episode of Belarusian collaboration in World War II, Belarusians could serve as local self-administrators. And here we have Mikhail Zuev, and he became the local mayor of a small town named Zaskoki, located 20 kilometers south of Polotsk. Located amid bogs away from the main roads, the Germans did not visit this place. Here, the people believed in an old branch of Orthodox Christianity, and they were known as the Old Believers, and they obviously hated the Soviet system since the Soviets oppressed religion. In Soviet times, Zuev had been imprisoned a few times and his sons were deported to Siberia. When Zuev became the mayor of the town of Zaskoki, they endured some relative peace since the Soviet authority was gone. The collective farms were abolished, and also the Germans didn't bother going all the way there off the main road. Now, who did visit the village were the Soviet partisans, demanding food and alcohol. Zuev and his men, they killed the very few partisans that arrived in the village. They picked up the rifles and they fired at a second group, chasing them away. Now, in the early phase of the war, the partisans were really decentralized. Now, the Germans, they couldn't care less. I mean, they weren't willing to help Zuev and his men, and they basically left them to fend for themselves. So therefore, they took matters in their own hands, and two neighboring villages joined in and they formed self-defense squads. They made use of captured weaponry as well as hunting rifles, and when 1941 had come to an end, 15 clashes between the Old Believers and the partisans had taken place. The Old Believers, they held their ground, and they were also in the advantage, since they knew the terrain. However, they soon ran out of ammunition, so therefore Zuev, he traveled to Polotsk. It was occupied by the Germans, and he asked the local German administrator for weapons. Now, the local German administrator, he could not promise anything, and he said, okay, I'm going to inform, give me a week time. By the way, here you have some cartridges. Turned out these were German cartridges and these didn't fit in Russian rifles. Sometime later, Zuev and his men, they were equipped by the Germans with 50 rifles, Soviet rifles, and ammunition. After Zuev began arming the squads, representatives from different villages reached out to Zuev and asked if they could join the Republic of the Old Believers, and therefore Zuev's sphere of influence widened. Early 1942, they went into the offense, so liberating, so to say, villages from partisan rule. Some partisans even went over to the side of the Old Believers, and by the spring of 1942 the squad had 4 Russian machine guns. Within the squads of Zuev there was strict discipline. Disobedience was often punished by death, and Zuev personally carried out the executions. It's believed that he shot 2 Old Believers and 10 non-Old Believers that were on his side. Zuev called his domain a republic, and by the autumn of 1942, around 3 regions were under his control. Private property and trade was allowed, and there was a high emphasis on ceremonies because now the Old Believers could practice their religion freely. He collected taxes from the villages and he used that to bribe the Germans or pay for medicine and weaponry. Some 300 people joined the squads. Among them there were also women. Most of them did guard duties. Now, they basically never left the area, only to do some reconnaissance and find information about what was happening in other areas. As the Soviets retook the area, Zuev and 1,000 of his followers, they fled to East Prussia. Now, from there, little is known of their fate. On one website, I read that some of them managed to reached South America, and that Zuev became a lieutenant in the Vlasov army, that he eventually was arrested and executed, but I'm not sure about this. We may never know what happened to him. You know, it's such a vast area, and there was so much destruction, so many people were killed, so many documents have been destroyed, so therefore we perhaps may never grasp the full story. A big thanks to the Patreons you see on screen right now, and a special thanks to Janusz Dosinkiewicz, Johan, Peter King, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rock Bart, RL, and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. If you want to know more about Belarusian collaboration, you click right here, and if you want to know more about Russian military collaboration in the Second World War, you click right here. I want to thank you for watching. Check me out on Patreon, give this video a like, give a comment. До свидания.